Welcome back to the Bible Lore Podcast, Episode 4, Disintegration. This week we've got special guest Dr. Kerry Sonia. Kerry is Assistant Professor of Religious Studies at Colby College in Maine, and her 2020 book, Caring for the Dead in Ancient Israel, is one of my favorite books in all of biblical academia. Kerry, welcome.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm really flattered to be asked. So thanks for having me on.
As always, I'll periodically bring in clips from our interview to provide context along the way, and the full interview will be available for patrons at patreon.com/BibleLorePodcast in a couple of days. I'm also going to include a fair bit of our interview in the next episode, which I realized halfway through writing would be a better fit for our discussion, so look forward to that. Besides the Mieroop and Redford books mentioned in the last few episodes, today's additional main source is Eric Cline's terrific 1177 BC. I've read quite a few histories of the ancient Near East, both academic and popular level, and it can be tough to make something so engaging when most of it's pieced together from fragmentary prehistoric evidence with incomplete written records. Cline pulls it off. Go read his book. It's not really focused on cult and mythology, but if you like the history side of this show, it will be right up your alley. For lore, I'm using Michael Coogan and Marc S. Smith's Stories from Ancient Canaan, which is a translation and commentary on some of the mythology from Ugaritic. All other sources, as always, will be included in the Bibliography under the episode description. Last time on the history front, we discussed the heights of the new Egyptian kingdom after the expulsion of the Levantine Hyksos from the Nile Delta, with the 18th dynasty achieving greater expansion and a relatively diplomatic foreign policy hitting a major setback with the fallout from Pharaoh Akhenaten's cultic and political centralization in the mid-1300s. The backlash from this power grab spelled the end of the dynasty after Akhenaten's death, and saw the rise of the Ramessides, the last Egyptian dynasty before the economic and political systems that kept all of the Bronze Age bronze flowing shattered over the late 1200s and into the early 1100s. Today we'll journey through the collapse, with its many battles and sieges and raids, and we'll say goodbye to the Bronze Age. This rapid and striking end to an entire economic system came with a lot of destruction and death, and that's why I've brought on Kerry today. Her work deals in late Bronze Age and Iron Age understandings of death and the afterlife. So, Kerry, starting off easy, what happens when we die?
Super easy question. Thanks for the softball. I like, the Keanu Reeves answer that he gave on, what was it, the Colbert questionnaire, where he said, I think that what happens when we die is those who love us will miss us. And I thought, yeah, that's an excellent way to answer that.
Well, and that really leads into kind of today's subject, because I think it really does inform that kind of tendency in humans, really informs it. So what did folks in the ancient Near East say around the beginning of the Iron Age, end of the late Bronze Age, believe happened to humans when they died?
Yeah, great. So basically, everybody went to the same place, that no matter what, if you were a righteous person, a wicked person, everybody ends up in this place called Sheol, right? This place that in biblical literature is often described as subterranean, as dusty, as dark. Not a particularly pleasant place to be, but it also wasn't hell the way that we think about hell and this concept of hell that develops in later Christian theology. But we have references like in the book of Kohelet. I mean, there's this, it says exactly that. Whether you're righteous or wicked, whether you're good or bad, everybody goes to the same place.
Part of your duty as sort of a person whose relative has died is to take care of them. So could you talk a little bit about what is the cult of dead kin, as you call it?
Sure, yeah. So the cult of dead kin is a term that I use and some other scholars use to really talk about the sort of complex of practices surrounding the care and commemoration of the dead. So I separated out into some sort of paradigmatic practices that appear both in the biblical evidence, but we also see in comparative cultures surrounding Israel. So that includes the offering of food and drink and other items, like incense, for instance. It includes the construction of commemorative monuments, the invocation of the name of the dead, the protection of the burial site, and even protection of actual human remains. And then, when necessary, the repatriation of human remains, often back to an ancestral territory, and giving them sort of proper, more ideal kind of burial there in ancestral territory. So in terms of like the actual behaviors and practices of the cultic dead kin, that's really what I'm referring to, is like those kinds of practices.
I'll bring Kerry back in when we get to the Baal Cycle to talk about the role of death and the grave as both a god and a place when we get there in a bit. Before we leave Egypt, though, let's start off with some Bible lore. One of the things I didn't get to talk about with Dan last time is the Egyptian tale of two brothers, a story from the reign of Seti II, the great-great-grandson of our final pharaoh from the last episode, Ramses I, which begins with a motif that may sound familiar to anyone who knows the story of Joseph in Genesis 39. In the book of Genesis, between the patriarchal narratives of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and Moses' Exodus, there's a story about Jacob's son Joseph. You might know him from his Technicolor Dreamcoat. Jacob treats Joseph better than all of his other sons. Joseph has prophetic dreams of being better and more successful than all of them, and his brothers, somewhat understandably, become annoyed and jealous. Depending on the source, he's either left in a pit by them and found by Midianite traders who then sell him to some Ishmaelite slavers, or his brothers sell him directly to the Ishmaelite slavers. It's a confusing passage because of the way the sources were mashed together. Either way, he ends up in Egypt serving Potiphar, the captain of the guard. In the tale of two brothers, Bata lives in a house with his older brother Anubis and Anubis' wife. One day, while working on their farm, Bata goes back to his house to retrieve seeds for planting. While doing so, his brother's wife, entranced by his beauty, attempts to seduce him. Bata rejects her, but after he leaves, the wife makes herself up to look like she's been assaulted, and when Anubis returns, she tells him that Bata attempted to rape her. As Bata is on his way to the house, one of his cows speaks, and warns Bata that his brother is waiting to kill him in the stable. The author of Genesis 39, apparently familiar with some version of this or probably a similar story, reworks the motif into his tale of Joseph in the court of an Egyptian bureaucrat. In Joseph's story, it's the captain Potiphar's wife who attempts to seduce Joseph and then, when he rebuffs her, asserts that Joseph sexually assaulted her. Really sharp listeners will also note the talking cow warning of danger has parallels to the biblical story of Balaam and his talking ass, but that's a tale for another time. The tale of two brothers after this point doesn't really parallel Joseph's story, as Bata doesn't end up in prison. Instead, Anubis murders his own wife when he finds out she lied. By then, though, Bata has already fled. He goes to the Forest of Cedars, a place of legend often located by storytellers in Lebanon's cedar-covered mountains. This cedar forest was thought to be where the gods lived, where Eden was located according to some, and in a time of desperation, the prophet Isaiah recounts the besieged people of Jerusalem around the year 700 BCE, looking to the forest house and its divine cultic weapons in a desperate plea for help. Perhaps it's just a coincidence, and there really was a Lebanon forest house which served as some kind of royal retreat for Israelite and Judahite kings, or it was a nickname for the royal palace, but the relationship to surrounding mythology is striking. Northwest of Lebanon's forested mountains on the Syrian coast, there was a port city called Ugaritic that handled a lot of the trade of the period. Not necessarily a major center of power, Ugaritic did, however, remain an open port for trade deep into the chaotic decades that preceded its final collapse. People seem to have been trading up until the very year the city was destroyed in the early 12th century. It was that important as a cog in this complex economic system. If Ugaritic was closed, it would be like the ports in New Jersey or San Francisco shutting down. You're not getting your packages anymore. We have several analogs in modern America. When manufacturing jobs were outsourced by trade policies culminating in NAFTA in the 90s, the capital flight led to the gutting of places like Chicago, Detroit, and Gary, Indiana. Similar deindustrialization has been a massive contributor to the poverty in rural Appalachia. And in all of these places, criminal activity flourished and quality of life plummeted in the wake of elites chasing profit through lower wages in other places. The arrowheads embedded in the ruins of Ugarit and the abandonment of the city for half a millennium after this collapse tell a story of a city that saw something at least as violent and somehow even more explicitly destructive than many of our modern economic collapses like deindustrialization or the 07-08 housing crisis and recession. In the wake of this destruction, new identities like the Israelites would begin to form and retell stories set in the illustrious Bronze Age. This is the story of death, collapse, and the gods of Israel, who emerged from these ruins, sometimes with a lot of their Bronze Age lore intact. Ugarit presents a fascinating case because it was both a significant and important city, but also never the center of attention or power. Call it the Baltimore of the Eastern Mediterranean. So when it came under Hittite control in the 1500s, life probably didn't change much. It was first settled over 5,000 years prior, millennia before the invention of writing. Sure, it was destroyed in 1185, destined to be buried in the sands of time, and not uncovered until about a century before our present day. But if you do a little bit of math, you'll realize that it will take until around the year 4000 CE for us to be as far from the destruction of Ugarit as those who experienced its downfall were from its founding. In Theodore Lewis's extremely helpful volume, The Origin and Character of God, he recounts scholar William Propp's estimate that around 95% of data from ancient West Asia has been lost. To me, an amateur, that almost seems optimistic. Propp's point is to caution against overly confident reconstructions of history, and this is why you've heard me and the scholars I've brought on use a lot of words like seems and probably and plausibly. It gets to an important point that I try to hammer home every episode as a reminder. We are looking through a glass darkly, as a guy called Paul will eventually phrase it. A species recognizable as a modern human started emerging from its immediate predecessors a couple 100,000 years ago. And for around 1% of that time, we've had writing. And of that writing, before the turn of the eras at year 1-1, the vast majority is not available to us. A few hundred miles northeast of Ugarit, at the Göbekli Tepe site near the border of modern-day Turkey and Syria, archaeologists found something resembling a temple built around 13,000 years ago. Nobody seems to have lived at the site. The nearest water sources would have been distant, and yet for whatever reason, humans carved large monumental pillars with widened tops, forming something like a capital T, with some of these pillars in the center of a pattern of 2 concentric circles. This would have taken determination, some form of wealth, and a lot of labor. This was at least 7,000 years before Stonehenge or the Great Pyramids, both of which also had cultic value to their builders, and it goes to show that this kind of large monument is the result of people having a desire to build big stuff to honor the things that we honor. Gods, ancestors, kings, spirits, our own abilities, who knows? We don't know who their gods or spirits were, nor any specifics of how they honored them, or who the peoples were who built the site and ventured to it, presumably to ensure their own continuing survival and good fortune in some manner. Generic, sure, but that's the best we can do. And this is all true for the majority of Ugaritic history. The vast majority of what we know about the city is from a very specific time period near the tragic end of its history. Again, it was destroyed 3,000 years ago, and yet it existed for nearly twice that amount of time. Think of every place you've lived and visited. How many can trace their history back to the equivalent amount of time in the past, to the year 4000 BCE? But before we get to Ugarit's downfall, we have to rewind back a bit, to when the Hyksos, the briefly ascendant Levantine rulers of northern Egypt, were being overthrown by the resurgent Egyptian dynasty from the south in the middle of the second millennium. During this period, the Hittite kingdom of modern-day Turkey was making deep incursions into Mesopotamia, and with the Persian Elamites from Iran to the east also making a bid for power, the old Babylon of Hammurabi was surrounded on all sides by much larger political entities. It was sacked by the Hittites and stripped of its prestige in the early 1500s, with Hammurabi's law code stele taken as a spoil of war in a later sacking by the Elamites. Being in the geographical center of all of these different factions is not a recipe for fun times forever, and accruing Babylon's level of prestige and reputation does make you a prime target. Cline calls the Hittite sacking of Babylon a drive-by shooting, essentially casting it as a quick smash and grab, which is probably correct, since it was the new Kassite Federation from modern-day Iraq who finally secured vassalage over Babylon, at least for a time. And the Hittites didn't rule that far into Mesopotamia. Again, they're out of Turkey, so it's a long road trip. And they mostly achieved claims over the western portions of the Fertile Crescent. This included Lebanon, Ugaritic, parts of Assur in northern Iraq, and much of the Levant, with its coastal city-states being a critical part of the trade routes. Controlling the various stops along these routes, like Ugaritic, was a key to any empire's success. In our first episode, I talked about the historical footnote of the Kingdom of Upper Mesopotamia during Hammurabi's reign, which briefly held the title of what could be called an Assyrian kingdom. They weren't really based out of Assur, but claiming some kind of continuity with older, more prestigious dynasties is a way kings tried to justify their authority and rule and connection to the gods. But this quickly collapsed with the death of its founder, and Assur ended up being traded around by Babylon and Mitanni, also out of Syria, until the mid-1300s during Akhenaten's reign, when the Hittites attacked Mitanni from the west. Seeing an opportunity, Ashur-uballit annexed portions of Mitanni from the east, and Mitanni's claim to political control vanished into thin air. This new kingdom of Assyria, as a political entity, would mostly survive the Bronze Age collapse intact, and would become a huge pain in the ass to the northern Israelite kingdom, eventually bringing about their destruction. Ashur, their city patron god, like Marduk, would shoulder his way to the top of the pantheon, but in the 13th century, they also brought Marduk into their pantheon. While Assyria kept Ashur as their chief god, they venerated Marduk as a way to authorize a tie to the ancient authority of Babylon, considering themselves the new Babylon in the same way many societies like fascist Italy considered themselves the new Rome, or others considered themselves the new Greece or the new Israel, and the same way their predecessors in the kingdom of Upper Mesopotamia had done with Assyria. As human societies, there's just about nothing we love more than pretending we're inheritors to some bygone golden age that probably actually sucked ass for most people to live in. Credit to scholar Andrew Tobolowsky for citing Nadav Naaman, who states, quote, "In Tukulti-Ninurta's case in the 13th century BCE, he removed the statue of Marduk from Esagil to Ashur and celebrated the Akitu festival there in honor of Marduk. He elevated the god Ashur over the Babylonian Marduk as the Assyrian Enlil, and adopted several new epithets and titles of Babylonian origin in his inscriptions." End quote. When Ashur became the Assyrian Enlil, the head of the gods, the chief guy in charge, he took on more violent mythology, in line with the era's pissing contest of whose god was the biggest and the baddest. This shift to harsher, more brutal gods was in vogue among the powerful political dynasties of the time, an era of violent aggression and expansion in the realm of regional politics. In similar fashion, Yahweh would later be said to trample the corpses of Israel's enemies, as all supreme gods in a political power center must. You gain prestige as a society in these times by warring and plundering and slave-taking from other cities. In Isaiah 63, the writer uses a rhetorical back and forth, asking Yahweh, "Why are your robes red and your garments like theirs who tread the winepress?" Yahweh responds, "I have trodden the winepress alone, and from the peoples no one was with me. I trod them in my anger and trampled them in my wrath. Their juice spattered on my garments, and I stained all my robes." Robert Alter's commentary on the passage notes that, quote, "The association between wine and blood is not only because of the color red, but also because of kenning for wine in biblical poetry, inherited from the Ugaritic, is blood of the grape." This transfer of even more violent power to the head of the pantheon could be done in a few different ways. In Greece and Babylon, Zeus and Marduk took Kronos and Enki spots at the top of their respective pantheons, and myths were created that emphasized and justified the way this was just and deserved. In Zeus's case, he violently overthrows Kronos after Kronos attempts to eat his own children, with Zeus freeing his already consumed siblings after defeating Kronos. As we detailed in our first episode covering the Enuma Elish, Marduk defeats the primordial sea goddess Tiamat to earn his place as ruler of the gods. Coogan and Smith put it this way: "The transfer of power from an older sky god to a younger storm god is attested in other contemporaneous Eastern Mediterranean cultures. Cronus was imprisoned and succeeded by his son Zeus. Yahweh succeeded El as the god of Israel. The Hurrian god Teshub assumed kingship in heaven after having defeated his father Kumarbi, and Baal replaced El as the effective head of the Ugaritic pantheon. A more remote and hence less exact parallel is the replacement of Daius by Indra in early Hinduism. These similar developments can be accurately dated to the second half of the second millennium BCE, a time of prosperity and extraordinary artistic development, but also of political upheaval and natural disasters that ended in the collapse or destruction of many civilizations, including the Mycenaean, Minoan, Hittite, and Ugaritic. This was the period of the Trojan War, of the invasion of Egypt and the southeastern Mediterranean coast by the Sea Peoples, of the international unrest related in the Amarna letters." End quote. In Yahweh's case, while they note he was replaced by El, that's probably not the most precise way to describe it. Yahweh was in many ways conflated with El, and he retained some of El's characteristics as a fatherly and caring god, but a trace of his status as a second-tier god still survives. Class, please open your Bibles to Deuteronomy 32. In verse 7, the author tells the reader to go ask their father about the old days, hinting that this is some kind of traditional saying among older generations. If you're using a translation that prioritizes the official Masoretic text of the early medieval period, it might read something like this: "When the Most High, Elyon, gave nations their homes and set the divisions of man, he fixed the boundaries of peoples in relation to Israel's numbers. For Yahweh's portion is his people, Jacob his own allotment." This passage confused folks for a long time. It seems to be describing the Most High God apportioning the different nations their inheritance, but then it says he divided people by the number of sons of Israel. That doesn't really make any sense. Were there only 12 nations in the world? And then it says he inherited Jacob, that is Israel, from himself. So what gives? Something scholars noticed was that in some Greek translations that were older than the Masoretic text, it read a bit different. It instead noted that Elyon, the Most High God, fixed the boundaries of the people in accordance to the number of the gods, and that Yahweh inherited Jacob alone. Now, some of the differences in the Greek translations, broadly called the Septuagint, are caused by mediocre translation or a misunderstanding of the text. But when the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in the 1940s, a fragment of Deuteronomy contained this older reading in Hebrew, which appears to preserve a tradition where El Elyon, El the Most High, gave all of the nations their patron deities, including giving the patron deity Yahweh his portion, Jacob, that is, Israel. Yahweh, in this understanding, was not the ruler of the entire earth. He was Israel's God alone. This aligns much more closely to what we see with storm gods like Yahweh, starting out as second-tier patron gods, who rose above their initial station to take the top of the pantheon. Noticing this potentially troubling reading, a later scribe seems to have corrected this text to make it fit in more with their preferred theology, where Yahweh was El Elyon, just like Ashur was the Enlil of the gods, or Amun and Re in the Egyptian pantheon were made into a single deity. Because the name El could also function as a generic term for a god, it meant some of these vestiges of their separation have survived the conflation, even if later redactors and editors became uncomfortable with this polytheistic cosmology. But who was El, the high god of the Canaanite pantheon? In one of the greatest pieces of literature recovered from Ugaritic, El's drinking party, El hosts, a drinking party and a feast for the gods. Quote, "El was seated in his drinking party. El drank wine until he was full, new wine until he was drunk. El went to his house, he reached his court. Tukamuna and Shunama helped him along. Then Hebeu confronted him, lord of horns and a tail. He smeared him with his crap and piss. El collapsed like a corpse. El was like those who go down to the underworld." Coogan and Smith have this commentary on the passage. The figure of Hebeu, described in this section as Lord of Horns and a Tail, is otherwise unknown in the Ugaritic texts. Many scholars think that El soils himself with his own excrement and urine, but it has been recently suggested that it is Hebeu who soils the drunken El. Later medical prescriptions use dung, which may be included in the prescription at the end of the text. End quote. This prescription is basically a hangover cure, including literal dog hair. Yes, hair of the dog is over 3,000 years old. Perhaps a part of the point of the story was to give a divine authorization to a headache medicine made of human excrement. El could be a warrior, of course, but he was also the good times father god, with the epithet the kind, the compassionate, managing a family of second-tier deities who could be quite a handful. There's a reason the Hebrew Bible has to stress that Yahweh is El, even half a millennium or more after these Ugaritic texts. El was a family god who seems to have been very popular among rural households, and reconciling the differences between unofficial cult and official royal cult is a big part of the Bible, one where there are a dozen different perspectives on what quote-unquote proper cult looks like. El names like Israel were rather common at the time, and we see names in this period like Raphael and the legendary Canaanite leader character Daniel, who is briefly and puzzlingly mentioned in Ezekiel 28:3 as a bastion of wisdom, and who appeals to El in one Ugaritic story to ask for sons who will continue his family. While he has a daughter, Pugat, in these patriarchal societies that was not as desirable as a son. The text then goes on to describe what the proper duties of a son are, and how important a son is for ensuring one's continued thriving in the afterlife. And while the story is fascinating, this may have been part of the instructional point of the text, understanding what proper care for one's ancestors looks like.
There's a lot of debate over how to interpret this portion of the Akkad epic, the sort of list of duties of the ideal son, right? And whether or not we should translate this phrase in Ugaritic, il-ib, as a deity, as like a divine being, or if this is a god of the father, a sort of patron deity. There's a lot of debate, and there are really good, well-respected scholars on both sides of that debate about how we should best translate that term. And the implications are pretty important, right? On one hand, if there's this reference to a divine ancestor, right? Il being seen here as a kind of determinative, right? Telling you sort of what quality of being this ib is, this father is. That gives us a sense that the dead are understood as divine, right? That one's father could be a sort of divine being, which really changes, right, the nature of caring for that ancestor then in death. However, if it's a patron deity, if it's, the sort of god of one's father, that's a little bit more of the same, right? That's more of sort of the imagery that we're used to talking about. So, there's a lot, right? Even in the translation of that one term in Ugaritic, that really changes the way that we're thinking about the status of the dead.
And so we see here the intersection of a few ideas: a natural human desire for the stability and flourishing of one's own family, which is then tied to the idea that an important part of this is caring for those who came before. Our own flourishing is in part due to our parents and grandparents, and it becomes critical to honor or even perhaps worship them.
In ancient Mesopotamia, we have all these texts that talk about the cult of dead kin, which the technical term in Akkadian is the Kispu, okay? So Kispu is how it's transliterated. So we have all these references to the Kispu, what it looks like, who's involved, and we also know from texts that survive from ancient Mesopotamia that if you don't offer food and drink and what appropriate sort of offerings to the dead, they can turn into angry ghosts, right? Or like hangry ghosts, right? We have these texts that survive from ancient Mesopotamia that are trying to exorcise these ghosts, these angry ghosts that are plaguing the living. Or we have diagnostic texts that are trying to figure out what ghost have I made angry, and like how can I placate them and get them to leave me alone. So this is a pretty pervasive concept about the dead in ancient Mesopotamia. And so it's possible, right, that there's a sort of comparable conception of this sort of quid pro quo between, or back and forth sort of mentality between what is offered to the dead in ancient Israel and sort of how the dead might pay that back, either positively or negatively. Now, some scholars have made the argument that certain texts that have maybe flown under the radar in the Hebrew Bible about honoring one's mother and father might also be a reference to the kind of care that you're supposed to offer for your family members when they die.
That it might go well for you in the land. There is this
Exactly.
kind of negative implication behind that if something's going bad, it's possible that you didn't honor them, but also beyond that, there's this cult of dead kin that if you weren't respecting that, if you weren't providing these offerings, perhaps that's where the negative consequences are coming from.
Exactly. That it could be like in the commandments themselves, right? Like in this commandment to honor one's father and mother, that there's this assumption about the cult of dead kin and the sort of ideologies underlying it.
And in accordance with this need to have sons to honor their ancestors, Donnell asks El to provide him with a son, and El promises one, similar to the way that the God of the Bible promises to make Abraham a father of nations. Gods, both male and female, were responsible for fertility. El was often represented as a fertile bull, including in the texts of the Hebrew Bible, and bull statues have been found in multiple locations around Palestine from the Iron Age and before. In the story, El provides this fertility, with Donnell's wife becoming pregnant and giving birth to a son, Akkad. The text is pretty fragmentary, but Akkad is given a gift of divine weapons, like the ones thought to exist in Lebanon. Anat, a warfare and hunting goddess, becomes jealous of his weapons and offers him increasingly valuable bribes, piquing with immortality itself. Akkad rejects all of these offers, infuriating Anat, who asks El for permission to take revenge on Akkad for this insult. El grants it, and when Anat has Akkad killed, it causes the death of the crops and a drought and a famine. Years later, Pugat goes to take revenge on her brother's killer, hiding her blade in her robe like it's Assassin's Creed, and disguising herself before getting Akkad's assassin drunk, and the tablet breaks off at this point. Best we can do is look at similar myths like the tale of Osiris in Egypt, where the dead god or human whose death caused the drought is restored to life, and the famine is abated. And thankfully, there's also another similar story among the Ugaritic texts, but this one involves a god whose name you're probably more familiar with, Baal. Baal is a curious case because he's not portrayed as El's son. His father is Dagon, a Syrian father god, and he seems to have been adopted into the Canaanite pantheon. But his position as storm warrior god and the rider of the clouds, an epithet he shared with Zeus and Yahweh, meant that he had the helpful warfare and agricultural associations that would ensure he remained an important fixture for kings for centuries to come. Military strength and a good crop were usually the keys to success for any king throughout the majority of history. So let's tell Baal's story and talk about his abilities on these fronts. Without further ado, this is the Baal Cycle. Once upon a time, the sea, known as Yam, wanted to kill Baal. Why exactly is unclear because, say it with me, the text is fragmentary. We're missing most of the first couple tablets. But if you'll recall the Enuma Elish from our first episode, which is a later version of this same story, one of the gods in that tale became annoyed at the ruckus and noise caused by humans becoming overpopulated due to being immortal, plotting to kill the other gods, and was killed in response, resulting in Tiamat becoming enraged. So Yam probably got mad for a similar reason, though it's uncertain, and he's definitely his own character. Yam's grudge may have been against Baal alone. El, in contrast to Enki, tells Yam that he'll happily give up Baal. Baal decides, however, that he's not going down without a fight, and arms himself with magical weapons. Unlike Marduk's drawn-out battle with Tiamat, Baal dispatches Yam in short order. But this is where the similarities begin with the Hebrew Bible's lore for Yahweh. Baal not only defeats Yam, which is the same word for sea in Hebrew, he's also said to defeat Litan, just like Yahweh defeats Leviathan. Litan, in this case, is probably just another name for Yam. Here's Coogan and Smith again. Elsewhere in Baal, other watery foes of Baal are mentioned in passing. One is Litan, whose biblical equivalent is Leviathan, see Job 41. Both are called the fleeing serpent and the twisting serpent in Isaiah 27:1, and both have many heads in Psalm 74:14 and Revelation 12:3. Other figures associated with sea include the dragon, Job 7, Isaiah 51, Revelation 13, Rabim, and the waves. All may belong to the next generation of watery enemies and are perhaps sea's offspring. So in Genesis 1, where we see Yahweh split Yam without a battle, it seems the sea may be stripped of its divine qualities, but other parts of the text have no issue personifying the seas and rivers and water-bound dragons. This is from Habakkuk 3, which might not be a particularly old text. With Neharim, that is, the rivers, is Yahweh incensed. Against Neharim, your wrath, against Yam, your fury. In this verse, we see Yahweh battling against Neharim and Yam, the rivers in the sea, just like Baal. Unlike Genesis 1, the author portrays them as divine beings. Interestingly, art depicting Hadad or Baal slaying a serpent with the sea flowing out of its mouth was found among the ruins of Mari, which Hammurabi destroyed in our first episode around the mid-1700s. And an even older piece of art from Eshnunna shows a seven-headed serpent being decapitated by a hero or god in the 24th or the 25th century BCE. The mythology is absurdly old, but the Baal Cycle represents our earliest written attestation, at least in manuscript form. Unlike Marduk, however, Baal is not crowned king of the gods after his victory, and Yam is described as El's darling, not an enemy of most of the gods like Tiamat was. And that kind of makes sense. Again, Baal is often not considered El's son, but instead Dagon's. The poor red-headed stepchild can't even win over his stepdad enough to get a dang house after killing the literal sea dragon. Dad who stepped up my ass. Baal works with the huntress Anat and even has to petition Asherah, El's wife, to be allowed to build his own palace. In Enuma Elish, the gods build Marduk's house for him to celebrate his victory and cement his elevation to the throne. Not so with Baal, as his defeat of Yam is only the beginning of the story. Baal's house itself has similarities to the temples of this period, which were viewed in some ways as the house of the patron god. The first temple of Yahweh in Jerusalem is described in Samuel in a way that is similar to this in slightly later temples. Coogan and Smith here set the stage for the real final climax of the Baal cycle. Quote, Baal refused to allow the installation of a window, but after the inaugural banquet and a successful military campaign, only briefly related, Baal changed his mind, and Kothar, his builder, opened a window in the house. Immediately thereafter, Baal revealed himself as the storm god, declared his sovereignty, and specifically refused to pay the tribute that was apparently death's due. The relationship between the window in Baal's house and death is clarified by a verse in the book of Jeremiah, one of the rare references to death by name in the Bible. Death has come up through our windows. He has entered our fortresses, cutting down the children in the street and the young men in the squares. Jeremiah 9:21. This passage implies a popular superstition that death entered a house through a window, and it may explain Baal's initial reluctance to include a window in his new house. Though recognized as king, Baal was unsure of his absolute power and preferred not to give death an opportunity to enter. As we will see, this caution was justified. End quote. Mot is the Hebrew word for death, and death, as noted in the Jeremiah passage and around a dozen other places in the Bible, could be viewed as an anthropomorphized deity, a god, but it was also a place that you didn't want to go. In the Psalms, it's mentioned that one cannot even communicate with Yahweh from Sheol, and in a rhetorical play on that, elsewhere in the Bible, Yahweh's fury is described as so great that it will breach this barrier between death and divinity, and his anger will reach even down into Sheol. Despite this separation, there's an infamous story in the book of Samuel, chapter 28, about a necromancer, commonly referred to as the Witch of Endor. In the tale, the King Saul has banned all forms of divination outside of the official city cult, but suddenly, he's not getting answers from his priests. Yahweh won't talk to them, and so he goes and tracks down a black market necromancer to raise the shade of the prophet Samuel, who had died some time before.
One of the interesting images that comes up in the Necromancer of Endor story is the use of this verb ragaz in Hebrew that characterizes the sort of process of summoning the dead prophet Samuel to this ritual, which is sort of like disturbance. It's meant to capture the sort of disturbance of the dead. We see this verb used in some tomb inscriptions that are threatening potential looters, right, of that tomb. Don't disturb this tomb in order to loot it. So it just seems like the nature of the interactions with the dead in these two contexts are very different, right? They have very different goals.
I wonder, would it, sorry to interrupt, it to me, it feels like, again, we're almost taking, if we conflate them, we almost take these theological consistencies for granted. Whereas in modern day, you would not say that going to visit someone at their grave, like going to visit someone's grave and maybe talking to them. I know Dan McClellan kind of points out that even the gravestones are often shaped kind of like steles or massivot, and it would be like conflating that with like a seance,
Right.
where you're trying to bring back and communicate with someone. Those are very, very different, and I
Yeah.
don't think there would be anyone who would conflate those things. And so
Right.
why do we do that with, are we being a bit theological in doing that with these ancients and their practices?
Right, and I think I think you're both right, and I also think that one of the effects of doing that, one of the effects of this conflation in previous studies, has been to marginalize the cult of dead kin and associate it with that which is considered illicit, foreign, dangerous, non-Yahwistic. I think it was used. This conflation was really helpful in trying to make this argument that biblical writers are intentionally trying to undermine the commemoration and care of the dead. And I just don't find that convincing. I think that argument really depends on the cult of dead kin being conflated with necromancy.
And I guess speaking of necromancy, again, something that's considered oftentimes through received wisdom illicit. Is there anything in this passage in Samuel
Oh,
that
yeah.
actually proscribes this practice?
Isn't that interesting that it doesn't? There's no clear condemnation of the actual necromancer. I mean, there's clearly an implied condemnation of Saul, right? Like,
Right.
obviously, like at this point in the narrative, the biblical writers are interested in portraying Saul in a very particular light, right? That he has, as you pointed out, he previously banned all these diviners from the land of Israel. And then you see this like huge hypocrisy where, like, because Yahweh refuses to answer him, he resorts, right, to this type of divination that he himself had banned from the land. So I mean, it's portraying him as having fallen out of favor with his deity. He has to resort to necromancy because he can't talk to his god in any other way. He goes in disguise, right? I mean, so he doesn't come off well in this passage. But to your point, the necromancer doesn't seem to be condemned at any point in this passage, which is a really interesting omission. And like, not only is it depicted as effective, but like super effective. Like when you
Right.
think about that, up to this point, Saul has tried all these other methods of divination and Yahweh has refused to answer. And the fact that Yahweh is sort of compelled to answer, he's like been made to finally give an answer through this dead prophet using necromancy, it almost suggests that necromancy is more powerful as a method of divination than all these other methods Saul has tried up to this point.
So getting back to our story, Baal brags about his defeat of Yam in a report sent out by his messengers. And Mot becomes incensed by this, similar to the way that Tiamat is upset by her husband being killed in the Enuma Elish. Not only did Baal refuse to pay death his due, but the gods could be a bit touchy about changes to the cosmic order, especially when some upstart like Zeus or Baal or Marduk had the nerve to kill a more primordial being. Interestingly, Yam is called Litan in this case, demonstrating once again how characters can be conflated and given multiple names even in the same text. The rest of the text is once again fragmentary, but Baal gets ready to fight death. As part of his preparation, he bangs a cow, I guess. The text is broken off again, so he has sex with a heifer, and that's all we know. Anyway, Baal ends up being swallowed by death in the first recorded instance of a vor fetishist bringing his angle to literature. But Baal, like Yahweh, was a storm god, and storm gods were fertility gods in a lot of ways. Fertile soil and fertile sexuality went hand in hand as a sort of cosmic metaphor. El, Baal, and Yahweh could all be portrayed as bulls. El may be referred to as the mighty bull of Jacob, depending on how one translates a particularly obscure bit of grammar in verses like Genesis 49:24. As Francesca Stavrokopoulou notes in her book God and Anatomy, quote, "The God of the Bible sexually takes the land of Israel as his wife, as signaled by the euphemistic use of the verb to know, and excites the cosmos into an aroused, mutually reproductive fecundity as he impregnates his bride at a place called Jezreel, meaning he seeds, a region famed for its rich agricultural soils." And here she quotes from Hosea 2, "I will take you for my wife in faithfulness, and you will know Yahweh. On that day I will fructify, says Yahweh. I will fructify the heavens, and they will fructify the earth. And the earth will fructify the grain, the wine, and the soil, and they will fructify Jezreel, and I will seed her for myself in the land." A lot of fructification. So when Baal is swallowed whole by Mot, there is no god to seed the land, and a drought tears through it. El and Asherah's sons are unable to fill Baal's role, but Baal's companion Anat takes revenge on Mot, shredding him with a sword and grinding him down with a millstone. Interestingly, unlike in the previous story of Danel's son, whom Anat kills, causing a famine, it's Anat in this case who ends the famine by killing Death. At El's request, the son brings Baal back from the grave. But Death returns too, and the cycle ends with Baal and Mot facing each other in combat once again, with a prophecy that this will continue every 7 years, seemingly for eternity. This seems to have been part of an agricultural motif, the kind that can only be seen in the Bible in ancient vestiges like the Hosea 2 passage quoted above. But the contemplation on death and the fear of death would continue to be an important part of this mythology as it transformed in the Israelite era. Eventually, in the book of Isaiah, a writer would go on to dream of a day where this mythology was reversed in finality, saying in chapter 25, "He will swallow up death forever. Then Yahweh God will wipe away the tears from all faces." In this hoped-for future, playing on the motif of death swallowing the storm god, the author swaps the roles with a sort of finality in view. This kind of hope for a final conflict that would get rid of the scourge of death and the cycles of death once and for all would continue to be expanded on in later apocalyptic Judaism, which in turn led to it becoming a cornerstone of Christianity. And way down the line, a resurgence of this apocalypticism in the 19th century has had a long, long tail, and you can indirectly thank this for your aunt getting into QAnon and going insane. But those hopes for a final defeat of death have never come to pass. And before you even get to Isaiah, we've got a flood of corpses to get through. Death hasn't had its fill yet. Let's get back on the history bus, gang. There's an entire globalized society to collapse. Shifting away from the upstarts in Assyria, let's pick back up with the history of Egypt where we left off last time. The short reign of Ramses I, the founder of the Ramessides. After Ramses I's brief stint in power, his son, Seti I, ruled for about 10 to 15 years, until around 1279 BCE. Seti would be the first long-ruling pharaoh of Egypt's 19th dynasty. His rule was the beginning of a relative stability of Egyptian power after the post-Akhenaten tug-of-war, but it also spelled the return of unreserved military engagement extending into the Levant and beyond, battling repeatedly with his lifelong nemesis Murshili II along the borders of the two empires. The degradation of diplomatic ties was not unique to Egypt and Hatti, though, as the wars between Mycenae and Troy on the Turkish coast that became the basis of the Iliad attest. And while Seti's incursions into Hatti set an important precedent for his successors, the two kings eventually arrived at a sort of understanding, what Redford calls an uneasy peace, by essentially punting the idea of any kind of permanent solution, and both ended up dying within a couple of years of each other. And Seti I is extremely important, and this is really critical, because his reign is also the setting for the prologue of the 1999 Brendan Fraser remake of The Mummy, where Imhotep and his forbidden lover in 90s style are played by a South African guy and a Venezuelan lady respectively. The movie still rules though, go watch it. Seti I seems to have died of heart failure in his 30s or early 40s, probably in 1279. His son and successor was Ramses II, the most famous of the Ramesside pharaohs, old Ozymandias himself. Ramses II had been heavily trained in his father's campaigns against the Hittites, joining many and gaining valuable experience in battle. He continued warring aggressively and repeatedly against the Hittites on the Phoenician coast in modern-day Lebanon and into Syria, with something of a draw recorded at the famous Battle of Kadesh, the first pitched battle that we can account for. Over the second millennium BCE, war became more advanced with the advent of chariots and composite bows and the ability to ship weapons materials like bronze over long distances. In other words, this building up of civilization was coupled with an impressive ability to destroy the same civilization. Ramses II gained a much more secure Egyptian claim over the Levant following the Battle of Kadesh, and by his 20th year he had forced the Hittite king Muwatallis, who was likewise the son of Murshili II, to accept a treaty. The uneasy truce of the fathers turned into a more secure treaty of the sons, but it's an interesting point to consider how long this peace would have lasted had the entire Hittite society not later fallen to pieces. Ramses II begat Seti II, and I'm unfortunately going to have to fast forward past him to get to his son, Merneptah. Merneptah is where we get our first mention of Israel, and he claims on a celebratory stele, primarily commemorating his victory over a Libyan coalition to the west, to have wiped Israel out. Quote, "Their seed is no more." A hint that writings from this era about conquest and destruction might not be the most trustworthy of sources. We also know that there was a petty king in Jerusalem, of whom very little to nothing is known about. Of course, even in the biblical text, Jerusalem isn't controlled by any of the protagonist groups until David conquers it in the 11th century, so that's not of much use to us. And it's of course possible that there was a small group of Yahwists mentioned in the Shasu Yahweh inscriptions I discussed in our last episode of Akhenaten. And maybe the Habiru hill raiders are a source of the term Hebrew, and some of these raiders settled down with that identity, fading into an etymological echo. That theory seems to be dying out, at least the etymological connection between Apiru and Hebrew. Regardless, we have zero contemporary indication that there was some broad unified identity connecting these groups, or that any of them look much like the Israelite and Judahite kingdoms that were to come. As much as it's more fun as a story to call any of these groups or some mix of them Proto-Israelites and imagine that we can reconstruct their story in part by trying to line it up with the Bible, it's just not good history. So that's about the most we can say about Palestine in this era. We have very few contemporary sources that discuss what will become known as Israel and Judah until the 9th century, some 300 years later. But there's something interesting here. The God mentioned in the name Israel is not Yahweh. As I mentioned earlier, the name El can also be a generic term for a god, the same way the word God can be generic or is often used to refer to the God of the Bible, or the way the term Deus, the root of the word deity, originally referred to Zeus's precursor in Indo-European cult. In the same way that someone reading the Latin Mass isn't referring to Zeus, the term El isn't always referring to the god El, the chief of the Canaanite pantheon. But again, there's good reason to believe that El, not Yahweh, was the original top god of the Israelite pantheon, with Yahweh eventually coming in as his subordinate. Outside of the somewhat speculative and rather difficult reconstruction of the Shasu Yahweh group, we get little from Yahweh, whether in names in the Bible or in general, until later in the Iron Age, around the same 9th century period where the Israelite and Judahite monarchies came into their own. Before that, Yahweh's barely on the scene. Now, in books that focus on the history of the Bible, Merneptah usually only gets a brief mention for the stele that describes Israel. But at Heliopolis and Thebes, at the Temple of Karnak, now long restored from the Ottonist heresy, among more celebrations of victory over the Libyans, Merneptah boasts of taking captives and the severed hands from a variety of peoples. Quote, "Beginning of the victory that His Majesty achieved in the land of Libya. Eqesh, Teresh, Luca, Shardana, Shekelesh, northerners coming from all lands. The third season, saying, the wretched, fallen chief of Libya has fallen upon the country of Tehenu with his bowmen. Shardana, Shekelesh, Eqesh, Luca, Teresh, taking the best of every warrior and every man of war of his country. List of captives carried off from this land of Libya and the countries which he brought with him. Sheridan, Shekelesh, Eqesh of the countries of the sea, who had no foreskins. Shekelesh, 222 men, making 250 hands. Teresh, 742 men, making 790 hands. Shardana, Eqesh, who had no foreskins, slain, whose hands were carried off, for they had no foreskins. Shekelesh and Teresh, who came as enemies of Libya. Kehek and Libyans carried off as living prisoners, 218 men. So there we have it. Sheridan, Shekelesh, Eqesh of the countries of the sea. Someone called the Sea Peoples had arrived. Merneptah repelled them, captured some, and took the hands of others, a common and brutal Egyptian practice, to both prove victory to those back home and to ensure those dehanded wouldn't be able to raise a weapon again. While their origins are difficult to recover, the names of some of the Sea Peoples are suspiciously close to names we might be familiar with. Shardana is probably Sardinia, Shekelesh is probably Sicily, and there are other proposed reconstructions of where the rest of the Sea Peoples came from, to some extent or another. Some are pretty speculative. A few decades later, An inscription from the time of Pharaoh Ramses III would include the Pelishet peoples as well, and this would form the roots for our term Palestine. Now, before you go crazy and start thinking you've solved modern politics, yes, it's true that the terms that are predecessors for our current designations, Israel and Palestine, both come up for the first time in a fairly contemporaneous period. However, while the recent conflicts, war, and genocide in the region are often framed around some eternal battle between religious and ethnic groups that have always been at loggerheads, one of the things this show will hopefully help folks understand is that that's an insane oversimplification and a frankly naive and unhelpful way to view the modern issues. For a particularly bad example, after 9/11, Aaron Sorkin released a special episode of The West Wing that explicitly used the biblical story of Isaac and Ishmael as an allegory for the modern-day Israel-Palestine conflict, casting the issue as explicitly some ancient religious conflict. This kind of allegorizing probably feels really clever and hits really hard if you're overly credulous. But the reality is that 9/11 and Israel-Palestine conflict have far less to do with some millennia-old religious strife than the reality of modern international politics, settler colonialism, the history of treatment of Jews in Europe in the 19th and early 20th centuries, and blowback from CIA intervention in Afghanistan in the 70s and 80s. Where does Bill Clinton bombing a Sudanese pharmaceutical factory, which bin Laden cited as part of his justification for 9/11, fit into the Isaac and Ishmael story? How does the constant oppression of Jews in Christianity's history that saw Jews fleeing to Muslim territory for respite fit into this narrative? It's great to understand the history of the region, of these peoples, of these religions, but it's completely anachronistic to apply these to today. And if you're listening to this show, I beg you to not try finding an explanation for these modern political struggles in ancient history. There is no one weird trick to be found here. There's no gotcha. Let these dead folks rest in the dirt. Let us understand them in their own context as best we can, and let our problems be our own. Outside of the names given to the sea peoples by Egypt that we can partially reconstruct and which can point broadly to the north central and eastern Mediterranean, their origins are pretty hard to track down, like I mentioned before. What seems to have happened is that the climate in Central and Eastern Europe, and even further east, became more arid over the second millennium, with a significant decline starting around the Ramesside period, and with crop failures becoming commonplace, the land couldn't sustain their population, causing significant migration and people searching for better land to settle on. Whether the sea peoples were themselves driven out of their own lands by other migrant populations in some cases or many cases is unclear, but they would form a key part of the coming collapse. They seem to have been only loosely organized and probably came from a variety of backgrounds and arrived in a variety of different confederations. There was no quote-unquote sea peoples invasion. There was a pattern of migration with some notable incursions and battles and conflicts, but it's a mistake to imagine some organized band of roving raiders controlled by a central polity. The actual process was much more natural than that. For a long time, the sea peoples were essentially called the cause of the Bronze Age collapse, and often every destroyed city or town that was dug up was attributed to them, as if they were a swarm of locusts consuming town after town. But that view has been under serious challenge over the past few decades. Other issues like the resurgent warring between Hatti and Egypt have received increasing attention, and as has a broader climate disaster that included not only drought and famine, but a series of devastating earthquakes. These folks could not catch a break. So we've got political strife and warring, drought and famine, and mass migration all at the same time, somewhat related to each other. While Cline's book that I recommended up top is pretty recent and an extremely readable book, I think scholar Thomas L. Thompson summarizes the collapse best in his book, The Mythic Past. I'll quote from it at length here. Towards the end of the 13th century BCE, the long period of aridity that had marked the climate of the late Bronze Age turned more severe. The Great Mycenaean Drought, named after the period of aridity that was involved in the collapse of ancient Mycenae, disrupted civilization throughout the northern and eastern Mediterranean basin. It was followed by a collapse of international trade and the haphazard destruction of many of this huge region's cities and towns. Drought alone hardly created the whole of this chain of disaster. However, it played a significant role. The empires of Hatti and Mycenae and the North Syrian state of Mieroop collapsed. The drought was to last nearly 2 centuries. The only major Mediterranean power to survive intact was Egypt, where the flood agriculture of the Nile was not as vulnerable to drought as the rainfall-dependent Mediterranean economies of Greece, Anatolia, and Syria-Palestine. Beginning around 1250 BCE, the Mediterranean suffered a severe drop in sea levels. Average temperatures rose and rainfall decreased sharply. The height of the drought was reached around 1200 BCE, and it lasted until 1050 BCE. The drought varied significantly from region to region. Its effects were more severe in the Aegean and along the Anatolian coast. With the collapse of Mycenae, large numbers of peoples became refugees. The onset of famine and widespread starvation uprooted whole communities and forced people to leave their homes and farms. Many moved southward to Egypt, both by land and by sea. Other refugees were drawn to the Phoenician coastal plain and to Palestine. They settled their families wherever they could. Over the course of several generations, they integrated with the local populations all along the Mediterranean shore. With their transition, a new and distinctive culture arose that was marked by both Aegean and Levantine characteristics. Although there is much evidence that the integration of these refugees had been gradual and peaceful, some undoubtedly took lands by force, and yet others were received with hostility. Many were repelled by the military, wherever it still had power. The refugees added pressure to the local regional economies, already severely stressed by the drought. Once international trade began to break down, the social and political fabric that supported trade-oriented agriculture in scores of interdependent subregions also began to disintegrate. Towns were abandoned. Fighting broke out in some places, and a number of normally productive and populated small valleys reverted to wilderness." End quote. What Cline's book adds to this picture is that it details the incredibly complex society that became so interconnected and so reliant on a variety of systems that it essentially was a giant game of civilizational Jenga, leaving it vulnerable to any number of issues that could pull a piece out, becoming increasingly unstable over the 14th and 13th centuries before rapidly disintegrating in just a few short decades. With all of these political centers facing threats from each other, from migratory populations that the land couldn't sustain, and from internal rebellions, trade was stilted. There were fewer and fewer customers, which caused a cascading effect. It's like the 07-08 housing market crash. Sure, it started with issues around subprime mortgages and credit default swaps, but this quickly caused issues with new construction being halted and banks collapsing, resulting in severe job losses that were only tangentially related to the core problems. These newly unemployed workers in a couple of significant sectors ceased purchasing luxury goods, and this had downstream effects. What started out as upper-class and petite bourgeois concerns quickly offloaded much of the impact onto the working class. The system's complexity made these ripple effects much more pronounced, with a million little way stations in every transaction acting as an amplifier. While we don't have a full picture of the variables at play in the Bronze Age collapse, it's becoming clearer that it was this very complexity that these civilizations enjoyed which left it so vulnerable. Only a few key political power centers had their own O'Bungler to help bail out the proverbial banks. Several of them simply disappeared. Our port city of Ugaritic, thousands of years old, was still taking customers pretty late into the collapse, seemingly until the moment of their own violent end. It probably didn't feel like the end to them, even as the walls were closing in. But the arrowheads embedded in the walls and the abandonment of the site for over half a millennium afterward attest to just how brutal the final blow was when it came. We still don't know who tore it apart, but all signs point to a brutal battle and rapid abandonment, with people leaving many of their possessions behind and fleeing the town to settle elsewhere. Perhaps some of these folks made their way into Palestine, and many likely returned to nomadic lifestyles, scratching out a bare existence off the land as best they could. Many undoubtedly died. But what happened to Ugaritic? Was it internal collapse and an uprising of peasants? Was it the sea peoples? Was it multiple things and an earthquake on top of it all? No clue. Sorry, gang. That's disappointing, I know. But around the early 1170s, it all came tumbling down, and an earthquake seems to have hit either during or afterwards, a collapse on top of the collapse, and once again, like Mari and Akhenaten before it, we have a suddenly destroyed and abandoned city that's given us an invaluable archive of their writings that were left behind. These writings included an alphabet based on cuneiform, and whether it was developed in Ugaritic or elsewhere, it was popular enough at the time that several inscriptions in this alphabet were even found in Palestine. Alphabets are significantly easier to learn than writing systems like Akkadian and other forms of Mesopotamian cuneiform. With Ugarit's destruction, this alphabet went with it, and most of the folks who learned it were likely either forced to find some other kind of work or died in the chaos. Writing in general would decrease in many places, and the significant technological advancement of the alphabet would take time to see a resurgence. Hattusa, the capital of the Hittite kingdom, was in a region of Turkey that became significantly drier during the period, and it was also a stop along the migration route down to Mesopotamia and the Levant. So with overland migration of the Sea Peoples, internal struggles, and the expensive wars with Egypt and Assyria still leaving it in a reduced state, it's no wonder that Hattusa, too, was overrun and burned to the ground around the same time as Ugarit. Assyria moved in and retained some control over the area during the collapse and afterward, but the Hittite Empire was over. Egypt contracted a fair bit as well, with some nominal claims over the Levant, but little in the way of real power in the region. And Assyria was in fairly constant struggle with Elam out of Iran for control over the Babylonian region in Iraq. This contraction of imperial powers left a vacuum in the Levant, and over the centuries, as the nomads and refugees, including the Sea Peoples, settled down and intermixed, they would form new mythologies and cultures, telling stories that incorporated much from the old motifs, but with new twists that reflected their own social circumstances. So here we are at the collapse. Wars, death and destruction, migration violently suppressed by empires who burn themselves down in the process, an economy in ruins, climate change-related famine. It's all happened before, and it will all happen again. While the mythology we've drawn on is only directly related to the Bible in a few cases, creation mythology that starts with chaos rather than creation out of nothing, chaos Kampf motifs about the violent sea and storm god who tamed it, the sun is the god overall who drives out the danger of darkness, it serves as a helpful prologue to understand what's about to come our way, as the societies who inspired the biblical texts build up their own brief kingdoms. Hopefully it's also helped to humanize them a bit, pull them out of our imaginations and into the real world in some way. We've seen them massacre each other, deal with social strife, claim to care for the poor, the widow, and the orphan. We've witnessed betrayals and backstabbing, triumphs and reformers, schemers and stabilizers. Soon, we'll get into the founding of Israel and Judah and the scholarly reconstructions that I personally find make the most sense of the data as I understand it, and we'll find the same core humanity, the same struggles and mostly failures to do better. Child sacrifice on the one hand, but also care for the poor on the other. Royal boasting of conquering and slave-taking, but also critiques of the monarchy and its oppression of the disadvantaged. Violent homophobia, but also implied homoeroticism. Xenophobia, but also pro-immigrant universality. Genocide, but also pacifism. There's a treasure trove of texts in tension with each other ahead of us. It's very human. So that brings us to the end of the Bronze Age. Many of the great cities were mostly abandoned or severely less settled, governments were smaller, roads were less trustworthy, and with the reduced ability to ship copper and tin long distances in large quantities, a different metal that had previously been less utilized would come and fill bronze's place: iron. It would take some time, though, for that to happen, and for some aspects of civilization associated with a stable and wealthy elite to reemerge. Greek culture, as one example, would take hundreds of years to bounce back from what some have called a dark age that slowed the progress of the early philosophers of the late Bronze Age era. Without a surplus of wealth that allows some folks to spend less time in the fields, there's a much smaller amount of space for writing and philosophy and other less profitable trades and occupations. But folktales and legends about this era would grow, and the absence of cultural and political hegemony from the likes of Egypt and the Hittites allowed new cultures to flourish, significantly developing their own cultures and polities and mythologies in the absence of the previously omnipresent globalized society. And that's where the Israelites and Judahites come on the scene. But before we go there, there's one masterpiece of late Bronze Age literature that I've so far avoided because it's such a massive subject and has so much influence on the Bible that it deserves its own episode. It would be remiss, of course, if we left the Bronze Age behind without discussing one of its masterpieces that would survive the collapse and stay culturally relevant for hundreds of years to come. It is to the Epic of Gilgamesh and the complex history of this saga's composition that we turn to next week on the Bible Lore Podcast. The book is Caring for the Dead in Ancient Israel. And from following your work, you seem to have another book forthcoming on kind of the other end of life, we'll say, the
Mhm.
other connected end. You mentioned it briefly earlier, but I think you it's something around birth and kind of pregnancy for women in the Hebrew Bible, which, like you mentioned, isn't very mentioned. Could you share a
Yeah.
little bit about that?
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for giving me the space to do that. Yeah, I mean, this was a project that I really got interested in while I was writing this first book, Caring for the Dead, because there is so much conceptual overlap. And not surprisingly, right? Especially when we think about the projected rates of infant and maternal mortality in the ancient world. These are two opposite ends of the sort of life cycle of the family, which often overlapped,
Right.
right? Today as well. I mean, something else I talk about a lot in this new project is the phenomenon of miscarriage,
Right.
which is something that, I mean, still people aren't as vocal about, as open about today, and
Yeah.
I think it's something that has been really understudied in biblical literature as well. But it's something that comes up actually pretty often. And so I think about this overlap between birth and death in biblical literature and the kind of imagery that gets used to talk about that overlap.
Are there any examples just from your, if you can give us a preview kind of what you're looking into?
Yeah, so I mean, this sort of conception of the earth as like both where human beings sort of like come from in terms of the creation of human beings, but also where humans return in death. So like there's this, this imagery of earth and mother as, the earth is womb, the earth is mother, and the sort of like returning to the womb, returning to the mother in death. I
Right.
mean, so we get that imagery in some of these texts and some of these poetic texts talking about death.
Famously, Ecclesiastes,
Yeah,
obviously,
yeah,
still read at funerals today. Some of those passages sometimes, and I mean, especially in movies, we still see that as kind of this idealized version of kind of how we understand these things.
yeah.
Which again, I also find fascinating, and I don't know if you'll touch on this in your book, but Ecclesiastes, so much of it seems influenced by Gilgamesh, which similarly touches on a lot of
Ooh.
those same topics. It quotes from it multiple times, almost both indirectly and directly.
Yeah. So I will be talking about some of the imagery of Gilgamesh and also talking about material culture. I mean, so
Right.
this is something that we talked about already today, but I mean, and I've written a little bit about this already in an article I wrote about the way that ceramic imagery sort of creeps into this discourse about childbirth and also about death. But I mean, we can think about something like Judean pillar figurines, they've been interpreted in so many different ways. I mean, they're these really
Right.
tantalizing, interesting artifacts.
And you're talking about some of the ones that are appear to be they have enlarged breasts
That's
and things
right.
like that. Some call
That's
them Asherah figures. There are a million theories about what they are, but yeah, very very
totally.
much related in some manner to birth and to nursing and things like that. So continue on.
Yeah. So, I mean, like, this is, like, as you say, there are a million different theories that scholars have proposed about how to understand these artifacts. Because, again, it doesn't seem like we have any text explicitly referring to these objects. So, we really just have, like, the objects themselves, where they've been discovered, their state of
Where they
brokenness
lay
or
and yeah, and
yeah,
right.
yeah, yeah. And so I think about, like, is it plausible for us to then think about how the emphasis on the breasts on these figurines might have something to do with nursing, with weaning, with, lactation and motherhood and early childhood? And then we find a lot of these in tombs, like a significant percentage of these have been excavated in tomb contexts. And so, like, does it gesture toward this understanding of the dead as being sort of childlike in their vulnerability, that they also need this kind of care? They need this sort of like ongoing childlike care offered by the living.
Right.
That's maybe one way of thinking about their prevalence in this sort of tomb context. So that's another kind of idea that I've been playing with in this project.
Fantastic. Well, super looking forward to that. Thank you so much for your time, Carrie. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me. This has been really fun.
Thanks again to Dr. Sonia. All of her information will be in the episode description. And of course, you can listen to our full interview at patreon.com/BibleLorePodcast. See you next time.